The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled toward my tiny house, its red and blue lights painting the surrounding pine trees in alternating colors. Through my solar-powered kitchen window, I watched Deputy Martinez step out, his hand resting casually on his utility belt as he surveyed my property. Behind him, 3 HOA board members from the Mountainview Estates luxury development stood with their arms crossed, looking like they'd just won the lottery. What they didn't know was that I'd been waiting for this moment my entire life, and the thick manila folder sitting on my kitchen counter contained documents that would flip their world upside down. Sometimes the best revenge comes wrapped in legal paperwork that's been waiting 3 generations to see daylight. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. My name is Lily Chen, and 6 months ago, I was living in a cramped studio apartment in downtown Seattle, working 60-hour weeks as a software engineer for a tech company that treated employees like TAS. Disposable batteries. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when my manager informed me that our team would be pulling another all-nighter to fix a bug that could have been prevented if anyone had listened to my warnings 3 weeks earlier. I stared at my reflection in the black computer screen, seeing a pale, exhausted woman who'd forgotten what sunlight felt like, and made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter and started researching tiny houses. Not because I was following some trendy minimalist lifestyle movement, but because I remembered something my grandfather used to tell me during our summer visits to his cabin in the Cascade Mountains. He'd point toward the valley below, his weathered hands gesturing at the rolling meadows and pristine streams, and say, "Lily, one day all of this will be yours. Your grandmother and I bought this land for pennies during the Great Depression. And we've been paying taxes on every acre for over 50 years. Don't let anyone tell you it's worthless just because there's no mansion sitting on it." Grandpa Chen had passed away when I was 12, and my grandmother followed him 2 years later. My parents, practical people who'd never understood their love affair with remote mountain property, had handled the estate quietly, paying the annual property taxes and occasionally mentioning that we owned some land up north that would probably never be worth developing. For 20 years, I'd forgotten about those conversations entirely, focused on college, career, and the relentless pursuit of success in the tech world. But sitting in that stuffy apartment, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the glow of city lights that never dimmed, I suddenly remembered every detail of those summer visits. The way morning mist would roll through the valley like a living thing, the sound of elk calling to each other across the meadows, the crystal-clear streams that ran so cold they'd numb your feet within seconds. More importantly, I remembered the manila envelope my grandmother had pressed into my hands during her final hospital visit, making me promise to keep it safe until I was old enough to understand what it really means. The envelope had been sitting in my safety deposit box for over a decade, untouched and nearly forgotten. When I retrieved it 3 days after quitting my job, my hands were shaking as I broke the brittle wax seal. Inside were survey maps, property deeds, water rights documentation, and tax receipts going back to 1937. My grandparents hadn't just owned a small cabin lot like I'd assumed. They'd quietly accumulated over 800 acres of pristine mountain valley, including mineral rights, timber rights, and most importantly, the easement rights for the only access road leading into what was now called Mountainview Estates. The luxury development had been built in the late 1990s, when property values in the region started climbing due to Seattle's tech boom. The developers had purchased a 100-acre plateau overlooking my family's valley, assuming they could easily acquire access rights to the private road that wound through our property. According to the documents in my grandmother's envelope, they'd approached my parents with a modest offer for a permanent easement, which my father had accepted without consulting the actual property surveys or understanding the full scope of what he was signing away. However, my grandfather had been more careful than anyone realized. The original easement agreement contained a clause that automatically expired after 25 years, unless renewed by mutual consent of both parties. The developers, confident that my family would always need their goodwill more than they needed ours, had never bothered to formalize a permanent arrangement. The original 25-year easement had expired 6 months ago, and nobody at Mountainview Estates had noticed. Armed with this knowledge and a newfound sense of purpose, I'd spent the next 3 months designing and building my tiny house. Not just any tiny house, but a sophisticated, off-grid home that showcased everything I'd learned about sustainable technology during my years in the tech industry. Solar panels covered the roof, feeding a battery system that could power my LED lighting, induction cooktop, and high-efficiency appliances for days without sunlight. A composting toilet and graywater recycling system eliminated the need for traditional plumbing connections, while a wood-burning stove provided backup heating for the coldest mountain nights. The house itself was a masterpiece of efficient design, built on a custom trailer frame that allowed it to be legally classified as a recreational vehicle in most jurisdictions. 24 feet long and 8.5 feet wide, it contained everything I needed. A full kitchen with quartz countertops, a bathroom with a shower and composting toilet, a sleeping loft accessible by a custom staircase that doubled as storage, and a living area with built-in seating that converted into a salon. Guest bed. Every surface served multiple purposes, every inch had been planned and optimized, and the entire structure had cost me less than $40,000 to build. More importantly, it was completely legal to park on my own property, regardless of what any homeowners association might think about it. I'd driven the tiny house up to the valley on a crisp October morning, navigating the winding mountain roads with the careful precision of someone hauling a valuable cargo. The first glimpse of the valley through the trees had taken my breath away, just as it had when I was 7 years old. The meadows were still there, though slightly overgrown after years without grazing cattle. The streams still ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. And perched on the plateau above, looking down at my valley like medieval lords surveying their domain, were the dozen luxury cabins of Mountainview Estates. Each cabin was worth well over $1 million, with massive stone foundations, soaring timber frames, and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to showcase the spectacular valley views. Private driveways led from the main access road to individual properties, where luxury SUVs and high-end sports cars sat parked beneath custom carports. The development's marketing materials, which I'd researched extensively, promised buyers exclusive access to pristine wilderness and unparalleled privacy in a gated mountain community. What those marketing materials didn't mention was that the pristine wilderness they were selling views of belonged to someone else entirely. I'd parked my tiny house in a meadow roughly half a mile from the main access road, positioned to take advantage of maximum solar exposure while remaining partially screened by a grove of mature pine trees. From the luxury cabins above, it would have been barely visible, just a small structure that could easily be mistaken for a hunting cabin or storage shed. I've been careful to follow all local regulations regarding temporary structures, obtaining the necessary permits, and ensuring that my tiny house met all applicable building codes for recreational vehicles. For the first week, I'd lived in blissful solitude, waking each morning to the sound of birds and the gentle whisper of wind through pine boughs. I'd worked on freelance programming projects from my tiny kitchen table, powered by the abundant mountain sunshine that fed my solar array. In the evenings, I'd sit on my small deck with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the peaks while planning the sustainable homestead I intended to build on the property. The peace had lasted exactly 7 days. On Tuesday morning, I'd been debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code when I noticed a small convoy of vehicles making their way down the access road. 3 luxury SUVs and a pristine pickup truck, moving slowly and deliberately toward my tiny house. I'd watched through my window as they parked in a neat line about 50 yards away, and 5 well-dressed individuals emerged to stand in a semicircle, studying my home like art critics examining a particularly offensive sculpture. The delegation had been led by Patricia Whitman, the Mountainview Estates HOA president, a woman in her early 60s who carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of parade. Personality. She wore hiking boots that had clearly never seen an actual trail, paired with outdoor gear that had obviously been purchased from an expensive catalog rather than earned through experience. Behind her stood 4 other board members, all dressed in similar mountain casual attire that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd open my door before they could knock, stepping onto my small deck with my hands clasped casually behind my back. Up close, Patricia Whitman's expression had been a mixture of barely controlled irritation and the kind of condescending concern usually reserved for addressing small children who'd misbehaved in public. "Good morning," she'd said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd spent decades chairing committee meetings and organizing charity fundraisers. "I'm Patricia Whitman, president of the Mountainview Estates Homeowners Association. I assume you're the person responsible for this structure." "Good morning, Mrs. Whitman," I'd replied, noting how her eyes had narrowed slightly at my failure to be intimidated by her presence. "I'm Lily Chen, and yes, this is my home. Is there something I can help you with?" The question had clearly caught her off guard, as if she'd expected me to immediately begin apologizing for my existence. She'd glanced back at her fellow board members, drawing strength from their supportive nods, before launching into what was obviously a prepared speech. "Ms. Chen, I'm sure you're not aware of this, but your tiny house is in violation of several county ordinances regarding setback requirements in residential structures. More importantly, it's having a significant negative impact on property values for our community. Our residents have invested substantial sums in their mountain retreats, specifically because of the pristine, undeveloped views of this valley. Your presence here is essentially destroying the very amenities they paid for." I'd nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering her concerns. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Mrs. Whitman. Can you tell me which specific ordinances you believe I'm violating? I spent considerable time researching local regulations before parking my home here, and I'm confident that it meets all applicable requirements for recreational vehicles on private property." The question had clearly frustrated her, as she'd obviously expected me to fold immediately, rather than engage in an actual legal discussion. Her fellow board members had shifted uncomfortably, and I'd caught whispered exchanges about property surveys and boundary lines that suggested they weren't entirely certain where their authority ended and my rights began. "The specific violations aren't really the point," Patricia had continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "The point is that you're disrupting an established community of property owners who have legitimate concerns about maintaining their investment values. Surely you can understand that a tiny house parked in the middle of a pristine valley sends the wrong message about the kind of neighborhood this is." That had been the moment I'd realized we were dealing with more than just bureaucratic concerns or legal technicalities. These people genuinely believed that their wealth and status gave them the right to control land they didn't own, simply because they could see it from their windows. They built their expensive cabins on a plateau specifically to enjoy views of my family's valley, and now they were angry that the actual landowner had dared to use her own property in a way that didn't align with their aesthetic preferences. "I can certainly understand your concerns about property values," I'd said carefully, maintaining the polite tone that had clearly been driving Patricia to distraction. "However, I'm curious about something. Do you happen to have documentation showing that your homeowners association has any legal authority over this particular piece of land?" The question had hit its mark like a perfectly aimed arrow. Patricia's confident demeanor had faltered for just a moment, long enough for me to catch a glimpse of uncertainty behind her authoritative facade. She'd recovered quickly, but the damage was done, and I'd seen the doubt creeping into the expressions of her fellow board members. "Our authority extends to maintaining community standards throughout the greater Mountain View area," she'd replied, but her voice had lacked the absolute conviction she'd displayed earlier. "We have a responsibility to our homeowners to address any issues that might affect their property values or quality of life." "That's admirable," I'd said, pulling my phone from my pocket and making a show of opening the camera. "AP. Would you mind if I recorded the rest of our conversation? For documentation purposes, of course. I want to make sure I have an accurate record of your position on this matter." The request had sent a visible ripple of alarm through the group. Patricia had taken a half-step backward, suddenly looking less like an authority figure and more like someone who'd realized she might be walking into a legal minefield. Her fellow board members had begun exchanging meaningful glances, and I'd heard someone whisper, "lawyer," under their breath. "I don't think recording will be necessary," Patricia had said quickly. "This is just a friendly conversation between neighbors, after all. We're simply hoping you'll be reasonable about this situation and consider relocating your home to a less visible location. Less visible to whom? I'd asked, keeping my voice genuinely curious rather than confrontational. Are there other neighbors I should be concerned about? The question had trapped her in an admission she'd clearly been trying to avoid. If she admitted that the only people who could see my tiny house were the residents of Mountainview Estates, she'd be acknowledging that their complaint was based purely on aesthetics rather than legitimate legal concerns. If she claimed there were other affected parties, she'd be lying, and we both knew it. Well, obviously, our residents are the primary stakeholders in maintaining the character of this area, she'd said, her voice growing more defensive with each word. They've made significant investments based on certain expectations about the surrounding environment. I understand, I'd nodded sympathetically. It must be frustrating to make such a large investment based on assumptions about land you don't actually own. Have you considered reaching out to the actual property owner to discuss your concerns? That question had been the final straw. Patricia's carefully maintained composure had cracked entirely, revealing the entitled anger that had been simmering beneath her polite exterior from the beginning of our conversation. "Listen, young lady," she'd snapped, her voice carrying the sharp authority of someone who'd spent decades getting her way through intimidation and social pressure. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is a serious matter. We've already contacted county officials about the violations your structure represents, and we're prepared to take whatever legal action is necessary to protect our community's interests." Legal action, I'd repeated thoughtfully, as if the phrase had never occurred to me before. "That's certainly your right, Mrs. Whitman. In fact, I think that's probably the best approach for everyone involved. Legal action will require accurate property surveys, pile searches, and a clear understanding of who actually has authority over this land. I'm very much looking forward to that process." My calm response had clearly unnerved her more than any angry confrontation could have. She'd expected me to be intimidated by threats of legal action, not embrace them with genuine enthusiasm. For the first time in our conversation, she'd seemed to realize that she might have seriously underestimated the person she was dealing with. "Fine," she'd said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "We'll be in touch with the appropriate authorities. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of your stubbornness." She'd turned on her heel and marched back toward the waiting vehicles, her fellow board members trailing behind like a pack of confused sheep. I'd watched them drive away, noting the way they'd kept glancing back at my tiny house as if expecting it to vanish through sheer force of their disapproval. That had been on Tuesday. By Friday morning, the sheriff's department had arrived. Deputy Martinez was a different kind of authority figure entirely. Where Patricia Whitman had projected entitled anger, he radiated the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent years dealing with property disputes and neighborhood conflicts. He'd approached my tiny house alone, leaving the HOA delegation standing beside their vehicles like spectators at a sporting event. "Good morning, ma'am," he'd said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed genuinely respectful rather than performative. "I'm Deputy Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. I've received a complaint about this structure, and I need to verify some information about your permits and property boundaries." "Of course, Deputy," I'd replied, stepping aside to invite him onto my small deck. "I have all my documentation ready. Would you like to come inside while we go through it?" He'd accepted the invitation, ducking slightly to enter my tiny house and looking around with what seemed like genuine interest rather than judgment. I'd noticed him paying particular attention to the craftsmanship of the built-in furniture and the sophisticated solar electrical system, nodding approvingly at details that most people wouldn't have recognized. "This is impressive work," he'd said, running his hand along the smooth wood of my custom staircase. "Did you build this yourself?" "Most of it," I'd admitted, pulling the manila folder from my kitchen counter. "I had help with the electrical and plumbing systems, but the carpentry and design are mine. I've been planning this project for almost a year." He'd accepted the folder and began examining the documents methodically, starting with my building permits and RV registration before moving on to the property surveys and tax records. I'd watched his expression change as he'd studied the survey maps, his eyebrows rising slightly as he'd traced the property boundaries with his finger. "Ma'am," he'd said slowly, looking up from the documents with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been admiration. These surveys show that you own considerably more land than I was led to believe. Can you show me exactly where we are in relation to these boundary markers? I'd pointed to a spot on the survey map, then gestured toward the surrounding landscape. We're right here, about half a mile inside the southern boundary of my property. The northern boundary runs along that ridgeline where the luxury cabins are built. According to these surveys, my family's land completely surrounds the Mountainview Estates development on 3 sides. Deputy Martinez had studied the map for several more minutes, cross-referencing it with something he'd pulled up on his phone. When he'd finally looked up, his expression had been carefully neutral, but I caught a hint of amusement in his eyes. Ms. Chen, I need to ask you directly. Are you aware that the access road leading to Mountainview Estates crosses your property for approximately 2 miles? Yes, I am, I'd replied simply. My grandparents granted an easement for that road in 1998, but according to these documents, that easement expired 6 months ago and was never renewed. The deputy had whistled softly, a sound that spoke volumes about the legal complexity that was about to unfold. He'd flipped through several more pages of documentation, pausing to read sections of the original easement agreement and my grandmother's carefully preserved correspondence with the development company. Ma'am, I have to tell you, this changes the nature of the complaint significantly, he'd said, closing the folder and handing it back to me. Based on what you've shown me, your tiny house is entirely legal and properly permitted. More importantly, it's located well within your own property boundaries, which means no homeowners association has any authority over its placement or appearance. I was fairly confident of that, I'd admitted. But I appreciate you taking the time to verify the documentation rather than just taking someone else's word for it. He'd nodded thoughtfully, glancing toward the window where Patricia Whitman and her colleagues were still waiting beside their vehicles. Ms. Chen, I feel obligated to point out that this situation has implications that extend well beyond tiny house regulations. If the access easement to Mountainview Estates has indeed expired, and if you're the sole owner of the road they use to reach their properties, then we're dealing with a much more complex legal issue. I understand, I'd said carefully. I've been consulting with attorneys about my options, and I'm aware that I have certain rights regarding access to my property. I imagine you do, he'd said, and this time, the amusement in his voice had been unmistakable. Ma'am, I'm going to go speak with the complainants now, and I suspect they're not going to be happy with what I have to tell them. You might want to stay inside for the next few minutes. I'd watched through my window as Deputy Martinez had walked over to the waiting HOA delegation. The conversation had started calmly enough, with Patricia Whitman clearly expecting to receive confirmation that I was in violation of various regulations and would be forced to move my tiny house immediately. But as the deputy had begun explaining what he discovered about property boundaries and access rights, the body language of the group had shifted dramatically. Patricia had gone from confident authority figure to confused questioner to barely controlled panic in the space of about 3 minutes. I'd seen her pointing emphatically toward my tiny house, then toward the luxury cabins above, her gestures becoming increasingly frantic as the deputy had patiently explained the legal realities of the situation. Her fellow board members had begun whispering urgently among themselves, and someone had pulled out a phone, presumably to call their attorney. The conversation had lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Patricia's voice becoming increasingly shrill as she'd apparently refused to accept what the deputy was telling her. Finally, Deputy Martinez had raised his hand in a gesture that had clearly indicated the discussion was over, handed her what looked like a business card, and walked back toward my tiny house. Ms. Chen, he'd said, climbing back onto my deck. I've explained the situation to the complainants, and I've advised them to consult with their attorney before taking any further action. As far as the sheriff's department is concerned, you're in full compliance with all applicable regulations, and your tiny house is legally situated on your own property. Thank you, Deputy, I'd said. I appreciate your professionalism in handling this matter. Ma'am, if I may offer some unofficial advice, he'd continued, lowering his voice slightly. You might want to consider having a formal survey conducted to clearly mark your property boundaries. Given the value of the properties involved and the complexity of the access situation, I suspect this won't be the case. Last time these issues come up, He'd been absolutely right. Over the next 2 weeks, I'd been contacted by 3 different attorneys representing various interests related to Mountainview Estates. The first had been Patricia Whitman's personal lawyer, who'd sent a certified letter demanding that I remove my illegal structure and threatening to seek damages for the diminished property values caused by my presence in the valley. I'd responded by hiring my own attorney, a sharp woman named Lily Chen, who specialized in property law and wasn't intimidated by wealthy homeowners associations. Sarah had sent a polite response, explaining that my tiny house was entirely legal and properly situated on my own land, and suggesting that Mrs. Whitman's attorney might want to review the actual property surveys before making further threats. The second attorney had represented the Mountainview Estates Development Company itself, seeking to negotiate a new easement agreement for the access road. Their initial offer had been laughably low, barely covering my annual property taxes, and had included language that would have essentially given them permanent control over my property for a token payment. Sarah had responded with a counteroffer that reflected the true value of exclusive access to 12 luxury properties worth over $1 million each. When the development company had balked at our terms, we'd politely informed them that they had 30 days to remove all vehicles and cease using the access road, as their legal right to cross my property had expired months earlier. The third attorney had been the most interesting. He'd represented a group of individual homeowners who wanted to bypass both the HOA and the development company to negotiate directly with me. These were people who'd paid substantial sums for their mountain retreats and were genuinely concerned about losing access to their properties through no fault of their own. I'd agreed to meet with this group on a Saturday morning, hosting them around the small table in my tiny house for what had turned out to be the most productive conversation I'd had since moving to the valley. Unlike Patricia Whitman's entitled demands or the development company's corporate maneuvering, these homeowners had approached me as equals, acknowledging my property rights while explaining their legitimate concerns about access to their investments. The meeting had included Dr. James Morrison, a retired surgeon who'd bought his cabin as a place to escape the stress of his medical practice, and Maria Santos, a software executive who'd found in the mountains the same peace I'd been seeking when I left Seattle. There had been Robert Kim, a small business owner who'd saved for 15 years to afford his mountain retreat, and Jennifer Walsh, a teacher who'd inherited her cabin from her parents and used it as a summer refuge for her own children. These were reasonable people who'd been caught in the middle of a situation they hadn't created, and I'd found myself genuinely sympathetic to their concerns. They'd explained that several families had young children who attended school in the valley town, and that losing access to the mountain road would essentially force them to sell properties they loved and had planned to keep for generations. Ms. Chen, Dr. Morrison had said, "We understand that we're at your mercy here, legally speaking. We're not trying to claim rights we don't have or make demands we can't support. We're simply hoping that we can find a solution that works for everyone involved." His approach had been so different from Patricia Whitman's entitled bluster that I'd found myself actually wanting to help these people. After considerable discussion and consultation with Sarah, we'd worked out an arrangement that protected my property rights while ensuring continued access for the individual homeowners. The solution had been elegant in its simplicity. Rather than granting a blanket easement to the HOA or development company, I'd created individual access agreements with each property owner. These agreements had included annual fees that reflected the true value of exclusive mountain access, but were structured as reasonable monthly payments rather than lump sum obligations that might force anyone to sell their property. More importantly, the agreements had included strict environmental protections for my valley, regulations about noise and traffic, and clauses that automatically terminated if any property owner transferred their cabin to someone who hadn't agreed to abide by the same terms. The individual homeowners had been willing to accept these restrictions because they'd understood that preserving the valley's pristine character was in everyone's interest. The Mountainview Estates HOA and Development Company, however, had been furious about being bypassed entirely. Patricia Whitman had sent me several increasingly angry letters, threatening legal action and claiming that my individual agreements with homeowners violated the development's covenants and restrictions. That's when I decided to demonstrate exactly who held the real power in this situation. On a Monday morning in early December, I'd driven my pickup truck to the beginning of the access road and installed a simple but effective gate. Nothing dramatic or confrontational, just a standard ranch gate with a combination lock, positioned exactly at the boundary between public road and my private property. I'd posted clear signs explaining that the road beyond this point was private property, and that access required permission from the landowner. Then I'd sent a certified letter to every property owner in Mountainview Estates, explaining that the access road would be closed for 1 week while I conducted a comprehensive environmental survey of the route. The letter had been entirely factual, explaining that I needed to assess potential impacts on wildlife corridors and watershed protection before granting any permanent access agreements. What I hadn't mentioned in the letter was that the environmental survey was entirely at my discretion and that I was particularly interested in studying the impacts of entitled behavior on fragile mountain ecosystems. The reaction had been immediate and dramatic. Patricia Whitman had called the sheriff's department, claiming that I was illegally blocking public access to private properties. Deputy Martinez had driven out to investigate, took one look at my survey documentation and property boundaries, and politely explained to Mrs. Whitman that I had every right to control access across my own land. She'd threatened to have me arrested for harassment, interference with property rights, and about 6 other charges that Sarah had assured me were entirely fictional. When Deputy Martinez had declined to arrest me for legally exercising my property rights, Patricia had demanded to speak with his supervisor, then the sheriff himself, and finally someone at the county attorney's office. By Wednesday, I'd received phone calls from 2 county commissioners, the head of the local chamber of commerce, and a reporter from the regional newspaper who'd heard about the tiny house property dispute and wanted to write a human interest story. Each conversation had been enlightening in different ways, but none had changed the fundamental legal reality that I owned the land and had the right to control access across it. The individual homeowners I'd already reached agreements with had been able to access their properties using temporary codes I'd provided for the gate. But the HOA leadership, and anyone who'd refused to negotiate individual access agreements, had found themselves effectively locked out of their million-dollar mountain retreats. By Thursday, my phone had been ringing almost constantly, with calls from attorneys, property owners, and various intermediaries trying to broker a resolution to what local media had started calling the tiny house standoff. Most of these conversations had followed a predictable pattern. Initial bluster about my legal obligations, followed by grudging acknowledgement of my property rights, ending with increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate terms that would restore access to the luxury cabins. The most interesting call had come from Patricia Whitman herself, on Friday afternoon. Her voice had been strained with barely controlled emotion, and she'd dispensed entirely with the polite authority figure act that had characterized our previous interactions. "Ms. Chen," she'd said, "I think we need to discuss this situation like adults. This has gone far enough, and it's time for both sides to be reasonable." "I'm always open to reasonable discussion, Mrs. Whitman," I'd replied. "What did you have in mind?" "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot," she'd continued, her voice carrying the forced friendliness of someone who'd realized that intimidation wasn't working. "The HOA board has been discussing your situation, and we're prepared to offer you a significant sum to relocate your tiny house to a less prominent location within the valley." The offer had been substantial, more money than I'd spent building my entire home, but it had been accompanied by conditions that would have essentially given the HOA control over how I used my own property. They'd wanted me to sign agreements limiting where I could park any future structures, restricting my ability to host guests or conduct business activities, and giving them approval rights over any modifications to my tiny house. "That's a generous offer, Mrs. Whitman," I'd said carefully. "But I'm not interested in relocating my home or accepting restrictions on how I use my own property. However, I am interested in discussing a permanent solution to the access road situation." "What kind of solution?" she'd asked, and I'd heard the suspicious tension creeping back into her voice. "A formal easement agreement that protects both your community's access needs and my property rights," I'd explained. "Something that includes fair compensation for the exclusive use of my private road, environmental protections for the valley, and clear boundaries around what authority the HOA does and doesn't have over my land. Oh. The negotiation had taken another week of back-and-forth communications, complicated by the fact that Patricia Whitman had seemed personally incapable of accepting that I held all the cards in this situation. She'd continued to approach each conversation as if we were equals, bargaining from positions of mutual need, rather than acknowledging the reality that her community needed my cooperation far more than I needed crash. Their approval. The breakthrough had come when Dr. Morrison and Maria Santos had approached me directly, asking if they could facilitate a meeting between me and the reasonable members of the HOA board. They'd explained that Patricia's confrontational approach wasn't representative of the entire community, and that most residents simply wanted a fair solution that would ensure continued access to their properties. The meeting had taken place in the community room of the local library, with Sarah present as my attorney and a mediator provided by the county commissioner's office. The discussion had been productive once we'd moved past Patricia's initial attempts to relitigate issues that had already been decided by property law and survey documents. The final agreement had been complex but fair. The HOA had agreed to pay an annual easement fee that reflected the true value of exclusive access to 12 luxury properties, with the payments structured to increase gradually over time to account for inflation and increased property values. The agreement had included strict environmental protections for my valley, noise restrictions for road traffic, and clear acknowledgement that my property rights extended to all land not specifically covered by the Bon Aren easement. Most importantly, the agreement had included a non-interference clause that explicitly prohibited the HOA from making any future complaints or taking any legal action related to structures I chose to build or place on my own property, provided they met applicable county regulations. In exchange, I'd granted a permanent easement for the access road, subject to the terms and conditions we'd negotiated. The individual homeowners who'd already reached separate agreements with me had been given the option to join the HOA easement or maintain their individual contracts, with most choosing to join the collective agreement for simplicity. Patricia Whitman had signed the final documents with obvious reluctance, her pen movements sharp with suppressed anger. But she'd signed them nonetheless, because the alternative was watching $12 million worth of luxury real estate become effectively worthless due to lack of legal access. The gate had come down on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, exactly 1 week after I'd installed it. But the message had been delivered and received. I owned the valley, I controlled access to it, and any future disputes would be resolved through legal channels that respected property rights rather than assumptions about privilege and entitlement. 6 months later, I was still living peacefully in my tiny house, waking each morning to mountain sunrises and falling asleep to the sound of wind through pine trees. The annual easement payments had provided more than enough income to cover my property taxes and living expenses, with enough left over to begin planning the sustainable homestead I'd always dreamed of building. The relationship with my neighbors had settled into a pattern of polite mutual respect, with most residents of Mountainview Estates acknowledging that I'd been fair and reasonable throughout the entire dispute. Dr. Morrison occasionally stopped by to chat about his experiences with off-grid living, and Maria Santos had become a genuine friend, sharing technical insights about renewable energy systems and sustainable building practices. Patricia Whitman still drove past my tiny house with obvious disapproval whenever she entered or left the valley, but she'd never again attempted to challenge my right to live on my own property. The legal realities had been established too clearly, and the financial consequences of losing access to Mountainview Estates were too severe for her to risk another confrontation. More importantly, I'd discovered something my grandfather had tried to tell me during those childhood summers in the mountains. Land isn't just about ownership or investment value or scenic views from expensive windows. It's about belonging somewhere, about having a place in the world that can't be taken away by other people's opinions or expectations. My tiny house sat in the same meadow where my grandparents had once grazed cattle, powered by the same mountain sunshine that had warmed their faces decades earlier. But now it represented something more than just a place to live. It was proof that sometimes the best response to people who think money gives them the right to control your life is simply to know your own worth and stand your ground. The story had spread throughout the region, carried by word of mouth through small mountain communities where property disputes and wealthy outsiders were common sources of tension. I'd received calls from other landowners facing similar pressure from developers and homeowners associations, asking for advice about protecting their rights against people who assumed that rural property owners would be easily intimidated. One of these calls had come from an elderly rancher named Tom Brennan, whose family had owned grazing land in a neighboring valley for over a century. A luxury resort development had been pressuring him to sell his property, and when he'd refused, they'd begun filing complaints with various county agencies about his cattle operations, claiming environmental violations and zoning infractions that had never been enforced against his family before. "They think they can wear me down with lawyers and bureaucracy," Tom had told me during our phone conversation. "But I've been dealing with government agencies longer than most of these people have been alive. What I want to know is how you got them to back down so completely." "I didn't get them to back down," I'd explained. "I just made sure they understood what the actual legal situation was, rather than what they'd assumed it was. Once they realized I held all the cards, they had to negotiate from a position of weakness, instead of trying to intimidate me from a position of assumed strength." Tom had chuckled at that. "Sounds like you played poker with people who thought they were the only ones who knew the rules of the game." That conversation had led to others, as word spread through the informal network of property owners who'd found themselves dealing with similar situations. I'd started receiving invitations to speak at local meetings of ranchers, farmers, and other rural landowners who wanted to learn how to protect their rights against wealthy developers and entitled homeowners. These speaking engagements had opened my eyes to the broader patterns of conflict between longtime rural residents and the wave of wealthy outsiders who'd discovered mountain properties during the pandemic. The specific details varied from case to case, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably consistent. Wealthy newcomers making assumptions about their rights and privileges, followed by surprise and anger when they discovered that money couldn't simply override property law and local customs. What had made my situation unique wasn't the conflict itself, but the fact that I'd possessed both the legal documentation and the technical knowledge to fight back effectively. Most rural property owners didn't have access to the kind of legal representation I'd been able to afford, and many had been pressured into unfavorable agreements simply because they'd lacked the resources to resist. This realization had led me to start a consulting business, helping other landowners understand their rights and develop strategies for dealing with pressure from developers and homeowners associations. Working remotely from my tiny house, I'd combined my technical background with the legal knowledge I'd gained during my own dispute to provide affordable advice to people facing similar challenges. The business had grown organically, driven by referrals from satisfied clients and the continuing influx of wealthy newcomers to mountain communities throughout the region. I'd developed a systematic approach to property disputes that began with careful research into survey records, tax documents, and historical easement agreements, followed by strategic communication, designed to educate rather than escalate conflicts. Most cases had been resolved through negotiation once all parties understood the actual legal situation, but I'd also helped several clients who'd needed to take more dramatic action to protect their rights. There had been a rancher who'd closed a road that vacation rental operators had been using without permission, a farmer who'd restricted access to a hiking trail that crossed his property, and a small business owner who'd successfully challenged a homeowners association's attempt to regulate activities on land outside their jurisdiction. Each success had reinforced the same basic principle that had guided my own dispute with Mountainview Estates. Knowledge of your actual legal rights, combined with the willingness to enforce those rights when necessary, was more powerful than any amount of wealth or social pressure that opponents might bring to bear. The financial success of my consulting business had allowed me to begin implementing the sustainable homestead plans I'd been developing since first moving to the valley. Using the annual easement payments from Mountainview Estates as a foundation, I'd started construction on a larger, permanent home that would serve as both my primary residence and the headquarters for my growing Goliath business. The new house was being built using the same principles that had guided my tiny house design: energy independence through solar power and battery storage, water independence through rainwater collection and gray water recycling, and food independence through large-scale organic gardening and small-scale livestock operations. But it was also designed to accommodate the needs of a business that regularly hosted clients and conducted training workshops for rural property owners. The construction process had been fascinating from both technical and social perspectives. I'd hired local contractors who'd brought decades of experience with mountain building challenges, and I'd learned as much from their practical knowledge as they'd learned from my research into cutting-edge sustainable technologies. The project had become a showcase for how traditional building techniques could be combined with modern renewable energy systems to create homes that were both environmentally responsible and economically practical. More importantly, the construction project had given me opportunities to build relationships with longtime residents of the valley who'd initially been skeptical of the newcomer with the tiny house and the legal disputes. Working alongside local contractors and suppliers, I demonstrated that my commitment to the area went beyond just winning a property dispute or making a point about legal rights. The contractors had been particularly impressed by my insistence on using locally sourced materials whenever possible, and by my willingness to pay fair wages for quality work rather than seeking the lowest possible bids, grat. Several had commented that this approach was unusual among the wealthy newcomers they'd worked for, many of whom had treated local workers as interchangeable service providers rather than skilled professionals with valuable expertise. These relationships had led to my involvement in broader community issues beyond property disputes and homeowners association conflicts. I'd been invited to join the local Watershed Protection Committee, where my technical background and legal experience had proven valuable in developing strategies for protecting water quality from the environmental impacts of increased development pressure. I'd also become involved in efforts to preserve the area's agricultural heritage, working with longtime ranching families to develop conservation easements that would protect working landscapes from conversion to residential development. This work had brought me into contact with state and federal agencies responsible for rural land management. And I discovered that many of the skills I'd developed in resolving property disputes were equally applicable to navigating complex regulatory processes. The success of these various projects had attracted attention from regional media outlets, who'd begun following up on the original tiny house standoff story with broader coverage of rural property rights issues and sustainable development practices. I've been featured in several magazine articles and television news segments, which had brought my consulting business to the attention of property owners throughout the western states. As my second spring in the valley approached, I'd found myself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory my life had taken since that Thursday evening when I'd decided to quit my job in Seattle. The decision to build a tiny house and move to my family's mountain property had been motivated by a desire for simplicity and independence. But it had led to a complex web of legal challenges, business opportunities, and community relationships that had enriched my life in ways I'd never anticipated. The tiny house itself had evolved from a simple dwelling into a symbol of the broader principle that people have the right to live according to their own values and priorities, regardless of what their neighbors might think about their choices. The legal victory over Mountainview Estates had been satisfying, but the real success had been the discovery that I could build a meaningful life by helping other people protect their own rights and pursue their own dreams. Standing on the deck of my tiny house on a clear April morning, watching the sun rise over the peaks that surrounded my valley, I'd realized that my grandfather had been right about the land being valuable. But its value hadn't come from scenic views or development potential, or even the mineral rights that had been carefully preserved in our family's property documents. The real value had come from the security and independence that ownership provided, the freedom to make choices based on my own priorities rather than other people's expectations. The luxury cabins of Mountainview Estates still dominated the plateau above my valley, their massive windows still framing the same scenic views that had attracted their wealthy owners. But the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Those views now included my tiny house, my solar panels, my vegetable garden, and the construction site where my new home was taking shape. The residents of Mountainview Estates had learned to see these additions to the landscape not as intrusions on their private paradise, but as reminders that they were guests in someone else's valley. Patricia Whitman still lived in the largest cabin on the plateau, and she still drove past my property with obvious disapproval whenever she entered or left the valley. But she'd also learned to respect the boundaries that had been established through legal channels, rather than social pressure. The annual easement payments she'd initially resented had become a routine part of her homeowners association responsibilities, no different from any other legitimate expense associated with maintaining access to Kemmer luxury mountain property. The transformation hadn't been limited to the residents of Mountainview Estates. The entire valley had been affected by the changes that had followed my arrival, and the legal dispute that had established clear property boundaries and usage rights. Other landowners in the area had become more aware of their own rights and more willing to assert them when necessary. Local government officials had become more careful about investigating complaints before taking action, recognizing that property disputes often involved complex legal issues that couldn't be resolved through simple code enforcement. Most importantly, the story had become part of the local folklore. A cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about rural property owners and the importance of understanding actual legal rights rather than relying on wealth and social pressure to get your way. The tale had been embellished and modified through countless retellings, but the essential message had remained consistent. Sometimes the person who appears to have the least power in a situation actually holds all the cards. As I'd watched the construction progress on my new home, I'd thought often about the lessons I'd learned during my first year in the valley. The most important had been that true independence comes not from isolating yourself from your community, but from understanding your place within it and being willing to defend that place when necessary. My tiny house had been a symbol of that independence, but it had also been a bridge to relationships and opportunities that had enriched my life in unexpected ways. The consulting business had grown beyond my wildest expectations, driven by the continuing demand for advice from property owners facing pressure from developers and homeowners associations. I'd hired 2 additional consultants, both with backgrounds in rural property law, and we'd developed a comprehensive approach to helping clients protect their rights while maintaining positive relationships with their communities. The success had allowed me to expand my own homestead operations, adding renewable energy systems that could serve as demonstration projects for clients interested in energy independence. I'd installed a small wind turbine to complement my solar panels, built a greenhouse that extended my growing season, and established a small flock of heritage breed chickens that provided both eggs and entertainment for visitors to the property. Each addition had been carefully planned to serve multiple purposes: practical benefits for my own lifestyle, educational opportunities for clients and workshop participants, and demonstrations of the principles I'd been advocating in my consulting work. The homestead had become a living laboratory for sustainable practices that could be adapted to various climates and property sizes throughout the Mountain West. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my new life had been the relationships I'd built with people who shared my values and commitment to rural communities. The network of property owners I'd worked with had become an informal community of practice, sharing resources and expertise to help each other navigate the challenges of protecting their rights and pursuing their goals. These relationships had extended beyond business into genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared experiences. I'd celebrated successes with clients who'd successfully resolved their own property disputes, and I'd provided support to those who'd faced setbacks or ongoing challenges. The work had been deeply rewarding in ways that my previous career in software development had never achieved. As summer approached and the construction of my new home neared completion, I'd begun planning the next phase of my life in the valley. The larger house would allow me to expand my consulting practice, host residential workshops for property owners from throughout the region, and develop more sophisticated demonstration projects for Furnex. Sustainable living practices. But I'd also planned to keep my tiny house, both as a guest accommodation and as a reminder of the journey that had brought me to this point. The small structure had been the catalyst for everything that had followed. The legal dispute that had established my rights, the business opportunities that had grown from that experience, and the community relationships that had transformed my understanding of what it meant to belong somewhere. On quiet evenings, I still sat on the tiny house deck with my cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the peaks while planning the next day's work. The luxury cabins of Mountainview Estates were still visible on the plateau above, their windows glowing with artificial light as their owners enjoyed their million-dollar views of my valley. But the power dynamic had been permanently altered by a manila envelope full of legal documents and the courage to stand up to people who'd assumed that wealth gave them the right to control other people's lives. The story had become larger than the specific conflict that had triggered it, serving as an example of how ordinary people could protect their rights and pursue their dreams when they possessed the knowledge, resources, and determination necessary to challenge those who would try to stop them. It had inspired other rural property owners to investigate their own rights and stand up to pressure from developers and homeowners associations. But most importantly, it had taught me that the best response to people who try to use their privilege to control your choices is simply to know your own worth and refuse to be intimidated. The tiny house had been my declaration of independence, but the real victory had been the discovery that independence could be the foundation for building something larger and more meaningful than I'd ever imagined possible. As I sat in my tiny house on that final evening before moving into my new home, I raised my teacup in a silent toast to my grandparents, who'd had the foresight to preserve this valley for future generations. To Patricia Wickman, who'd unknowingly taught me that the most powerful response to entitled behavior is simply to stand your ground and let the law work the way it was designed to work. The tiny house would remain in the meadow, a permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences, and that the person who appears to have the least power in a situation might actually own the entire valley.